So this is the last session for the evening, and you're probably really tired of seeing me. And so I'm very fortunate that my good friend and colleague Shazeen Attari, it's right here, has agreed to moderate the session. So we're going to begin with some introductions, and then I'll have a very, very short framing keynote, and then we're going to work through into the panel discussion that Shazeen will moderate. So I'm going to hand over to her, and then I'll come back.
All right, thank you, everyone. What an amazing day it's been already. I've learned so much. So we just realized that nobody actually introduced our wonderful colleague, Anu. So let me just take a minute to introduce her. So Professor Anu Ramaswamy is a brilliant interdisciplinary environmental engineer and professor here at Princeton, and also the inaugural lead for the MS Chanda Center here that focuses on global India. I first got to meet Anu through our wonderful colleagues at Carnegie Mellon, and both of us are trained in civil and environmental engineering, and that's how we both met. And so with that, let's give a warm round of applause to our wonderful lead today and welcome her back to the podium so she can talk to us a little bit about sustainability transitions. Thank you.
Thank you, Shazeen. I also wanted to say both Shazeen and I were involved with the engineering and public policy program at Carnegie Mellon, so we crossed a few boundaries, although 10 years apart? Yeah. So this is truly a mini keynote because when we had a phone call amongst us, we realized it's the last session of the day, everyone's going to be tired. And so we're going to have very few slides, except for this framing slide. So I wanted to maybe talk a bit about sustainability systems. And for a while, I don't know how any of you define sustainability. Anyone, when you say sustainability, what definition comes to your mind? I'm just curious. That's one. Any other? That's a good one. Anything else? Do no harm. Okay, so all of these. So there are actually 500 to 600 definitions of sustainability. And the ones that people have converged on, that actually came out of this really excellent paper, is a good life for all within planetary boundaries. So it's recognizing the inequalities that we just covered in the previous session. It's not talking about economy. It's talking about a good life, because it says GDP per capita is not the same as a good life. And it's saying that the planet constrains us, and so if we want to have a good life for all within planetary boundaries, we have to think in systems. So these are my colleagues from the UK. It's an excellent paper in Nature Sustainability, which basically says at the heart of between nature and social outcomes, we have these provisioning systems. And this is where technology and infrastructure has changed so much that if you don't keep up with them, you don't really fully understand the relationship between natural systems and those societal outcomes, which could be your basic needs, but also life satisfaction, health, democracy. I mean, this paper actually talks about democracy as well. And so a lot of our work in sustainability systems is making that connection and developing more analytic tools so that it's not just an aspiration. You can measure progress, you can measure interrelationships. So that's the goal. It's a work in progress. And so my own work focuses on the physical system. So I know when Pramod was talking, I don't know if he's still here, he was saying digital infrastructure is like any other infrastructure. But the issue here is you absolutely need physical infrastructure. You cannot live without roti, kapada, makan, everyone talks about, but also some amount of greenery. And the importance of these systems is that, wait, what happened? Yeah. The importance of these systems is that your energy supply, municipal water, sanitation, mobility, food supply, buildings, and green spaces shape almost, 80% of your greenhouse gas emissions. They shape 96% of your water withdrawals. But also, if you look at the global burden of disease study, 1 in 5 premature mortalities is related to poor provisioning systems, right? Lack of access to sanitation or air pollution from polluting energy. And so this provides us sort of a systemic way to think about how can we think about the future of India, the US, or the world, where we could address climate change, water security, zero carbon goals, zero hunger. We talked about it in the previous session, while being aware that we are in a finite planet. And so the picture we usually see is, remember the blue marble, when you look at the Earth from outer space, that tells you that that's all you have. And our population has increased so much that we are affecting the planet at scale in ways that we've never done before. And so these kinds of frameworks help us connect what happens locally. So this is another framework that shows these provisioning systems, but with a people-centered approach. These are human beings in cities or villages or human settlements. They need these physical provisioning systems as well as social provisioning systems like healthcare that Vikram talked about, like education, markets, so that you can exchange, you can get value for your skills. But they're so connected. We're so connected with where our food comes from, where our energy comes from, that we're actually here affecting the planet at scale, and it allows us to make local decisions that are compatible with local goals, but also global goals. And so that's one aspect. So Divya mentioned the Descent project, this kind of approach to look at sustainability in a systemic way is another focus at Achada Center, looking at sustainability. So I thought with that framing, what we have here is, in fact, intentional. We have Nikit Abhyankar, who's going to talk about energy systems from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I'm going to introduce them in a bit. We have Balaji Rajagopalan, who's going to talk about water and climate, where there are a lot of you'll talk more, so I won't reveal it. We'll follow that with Manu Lal, Upmanu Lal, who recently is at Arizona State University, was previously at Columbia University, and both of Manu and Balaji have been colleagues on previous work. And Manu will talk about agriculture and water. And we thought we'll bring Prabhu back from the previous session so we can continue the conversation on nutrition, because its food systems and nutrition are really important. So I want to just say that in my lab, I'll give you a brief introduction to my lab so that I don't have to bring it up again. This is actually what we do. We look at these physical sectors, buildings, energy, food, green infrastructure, mobility, water, and waste, and how they interact. But we also look at outcomes in a very different way. So we look at well-being. So not only GDP per capita, but subjective well-being. Vikram talked about mental well-being. So there are now good measures to see how people feel. You can look at people's emotional well-being. We can look at their evaluative well-being. We can look at health outcomes of the type that Sangeeta shared with you, and the global burden of disease produces. We could look at environment, footprints of carbon, water. We look at social equity, which we just spoke about. Livability, no one quite knows what it is. We're trying to figure that out, and their trade-offs. And so with that, I wanted to say one other thing about sustainability system science that has evolved, is this question of knowledge co-production. That if we are doing or tackling questions around inequality, just like Dr. Barwa said, you can't, scientists and engineers and public health knows this really well, you can't do this in a top-down way or in a technocratic way. And so at the University of Colorado in Boulder, we had a program at the nexus of anthropology and public health. And I know my colleague Joao was here. I think Vikram, you met him. There was a lot of interest in looking at how do you match up bottom-up community conversations with the necessity of having infrastructure like Pramod described that's really complex, networks of energy supply, networks of water supply. And I won't go into this in detail, but that there's a lot of work in interdisciplinary sustainability talking about how do scientists create actionable science that can be implemented at different levels of government at the appropriate scale. What's the right scale? How do you collaborate? And how do we get out of our academic heads, where we think we are experts in everything, to be there as people who are not experts, because we don't know these complex interactions. So that's what I wanted to say. In my own research, we look at carbon footprints. I won't get into this, but it helps cities recognize who they are. We've done this city after city, and they understand the same sectors I showed you are being shown over here: buildings, energy use, mobility, air travel, cement, fuel processing, food. These are all greenhouse gas emissions. This is Delhi. This is Denver. We have a similar one for Delhi. And simultaneously, we're also using the global, I think this is Delhi. And so you can see this is Delhi. And we're simultaneously doing things related to disease burden. These same sectors are affecting health. And this is, this is a work in progress. But you can look at the burden of disease in urban India. And we've done this now for 40 cities. We all know outdoor air pollution is really big, but unsafe water continues. Unsafe sanitation continues. Prabhu talked about diets low in fruits. You see the impact. Nutrition is important, and also low physical activity. It's amazing how much, we talked about obesity, but part of it is also how little active mobility is restrained or constrained. If you go to any Indian city, we're not walking. Sometimes they say the footpath is not there, it's not safe, we can't walk. But across socioeconomic status, India has done this, America has this ATUS, America Time Use Study. There's a similar study in India which shows little physical mobility. And so you have these kinds of issues: noise pollution, extreme events. And so looking at health, doing surveys on well-being, and connecting it to how infrastructure is today helps us think about this lab goal. Can we think of integrative design to reimagine our cities, rethink our cities and provisioning systems, so that they can be decarbonized, they can be healthy, they can be climate resilient and equitable. And so with that, that's the big goal, but I'm sure that's the big goal for society too. What I wanted to say is that it's truly an honor that we have all of these really experts in this field who have worked in India in a partnership way. And like I said, Nikita Abhyankar is at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab as well as UC Berkeley, talking about India's energy transition. We have Rajagopalan Balaji. He's at CIRIS, at CU Boulder. He'll talk about water and climate. We'll follow that with Manu Lal, who will be talking about water and the agricultural system. Prabhu will come back with the nutrition. And I've said a lot on cities, so I'll just participate in the discussion on cities. So that's the flow. And I just wanted to say, you may think, oh, all of these people, which one of them does anything on social systems? And that's where Shazeen comes in. Her expertise is on people and institutions, and she's at the University of, Indiana University at Bloomington, working a lot on institutional design for transitions. So I'm going to hand off to Shazeen and have the luxury of being a panelist. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I know all of you are somewhat tired. So as the moderator, I've taken some power and ownership of how to design the last session today. And so I've broken it up into two separate rounds. The first round, I'm going to ask each of the panelists, just in 5 minutes, to tell us about two big challenges and two big opportunities related to their sector of interest and how it impacts India. And in the second sort of round, we're going to talk about future solutions. So let's start with the first round, and very briefly, so I'm going to hopefully leave a lot of time for Q&A at the end. Nikit, up to you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Shazin, and thank you, Anu. What a fantastic gathering. So this is the last session, and what better than hearing about some complex numbers and doing some mental math? So just be ready. So I think I'm just going to start by telling you three numbers: 20, 500, and 900. There's going to be a quiz later. 20, 500, and 900. 900 are the number of cars per 1,000 people in the US. 500 are the number of cars per 1,000 people in Japan, UK, Germany, France, countries with some of the most advanced public transportation systems. And 20 are the number of cars per 1,000 people in India. So it really doesn't matter which development pathway India takes, whether it's the public transport focused or private transport focused, as in the US. A massive growth in energy demand is forthcoming in India in the coming decades. I just don't want to belabor the point, but you don't look tired enough, so few more numbers. 1,000, 5,000, and 11,000. So 11,000 kilowatt hours per year is the annual electricity consumption on average in the US per capita. Around 5,000, 6,000 annual electricity kilowatt hours per year is the annual per capita electricity consumption in Japan, Germany, UK, France, and so on. 1,000 is the annual per capita electricity consumption kilowatt hours per year in India. So again, a massive growth is forthcoming. While this is usually challenging, nearly 4 to 5-fold growth over the next 20, 30 years, but this also presents with a new opportunity. And this new opportunity is really twofold. Number one, what this means is nearly 70 to 75% of the energy infrastructure that will be built in India by 2050 is yet to be built. That also, as I mentioned, this presents the scale challenge, but on the flip side, this is also the time when the clean energy prices have dropped dramatically over the last 5, 10, 15 years and are truly the cheapest source of energy compared with fossil alternatives. May it be coal, may it be gas. Even in case of India, solar, including battery storage, is now becoming cheaper than the domestic coal-produced electricity. So this is a huge opportunity as I see it. The second aspect, is, and this is truly unique to India and also certain other countries like Japan and Korea, is India imports 90% of its oil consumption. And there is no domestic oil resource in sight. So as years go by, the oil consumption and oil imports are only going to increase if no action is taken. Nearly 75 to 80% of the industrial coking coal, meaning the coal that is used for steel production and iron production, is imported. And again, there are very limited domestic coking coal sources. So that's why as industrialization increases, steel production increases, infrastructure requirements increase, the coking coal imports also increase. And this creates nearly $150 to $170 billion of foreign exchange burden every year, which is close to nearly 3 to 5% of India's GDP, depending on how you count it. So most of the real growth in GDP essentially just goes out of the country to import energy. And this is a major strategic opportunity that India can leverage on. And in addition to the foreign exchange burden, in general, fluctuations in energy prices is also a major contributor to the general consumer inflation, freight movement cost, and so on and so forth. So clean energy, again, offers an opportunity to inflation-proof our energy expenses, freight movement costs, and offer an advantage to the industry. In general, India did not cause the climate change problem. So I just want to be very clear that India should not bear the same responsibility as the Annex 1 industrialized countries to mitigate the climate change problem. However, given, again, I don't want to go into the climate research per se, but India cannot afford an inaction on climate mitigation. The impacts of climate change are going to be particularly harsh on India, and that's why India just cannot afford inaction. Thankfully, we are at such a juncture where technological feasibility, environmental sustainability, and economic viability, all three dimensions are aligning towards a clean energy solution, and they are all pointing in the same direction. Finally, I think Anu also, just one final point. Anu also talked about the disease burden and the mortality burden and so on and so forth. Just the outdoor air pollution related deaths in India, they are more than the annual deaths caused by malaria, AIDS combined. So this is not only an environmental challenge, but this is also necessarily a public health challenge, and it needs to be tackled in such a way. Thank you.
Professor Balaji, you're next.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anu, for the invite. And it's been a wonderful day so far, as I echo others. I've learned a lot, and I look forward to learning more. So I had 2 slides. I think I'm the only one on the panel with slides after Anu. And Anu was very strict. She said only 2. So I tried to put in as judiciously asking what she wanted, mainly as a way to kind of focus and just to kind of spawn thoughts, not necessarily to kill people with PowerPoints. Okay. So when you talk of India, you cannot understand India if you don't understand the monsoon. And by monsoon, as we all know, most of you, I'm sure, grew up in India, where 80% of the rain comes within 3 to 4 months during the summer, June to September. And I always joke when we look at weather forecast in summer, I live in Colorado, and we get those occasional summer monsoonal flow. I put monsoonal in quotes, and the weather forecasters are excited. Oh, we have a monsoon. And I tell my colleagues, everybody has monsoon envy. Okay. And they all want to call some of their rains monsoon. And the summer thunderstorm is the closest it gets. So whenever it's summer raining, they're all like monsoonal. And I have to tell them, no, this is nothing compared to what real monsoon is. But anyway, go ahead and indulge your fantasies of monsoon, because you haven't lived in India. So monsoon is extremely unique, and it stands out in the global climate system as its own. And I will be very careful, because I can wax for hours on monsoon. So what I want to point out here, what you're seeing is the top left plot is the all India rainfall over starting from 1870 to present. And what you see are deviations from the mean. So the deviations in the bottom, the red colors, are when there were droughts. And morning, one of the speakers mentioned about famine. So you can even spot the big famines in there. Those big red bars are before independence or until around the time were the famines. And the the blues are the wet. So one thing that jumps out is there is so much variability from year to year. Okay? And not only year to year, variability from multi-year to multi-years. So if you look at the early part of 20th century, it was wet, and then you have these increasing stretches of droughts when you get into the 1970s, and everything in between. And you can directly correlate the socioeconomic well-being, everything that was talked about in the morning, the economy, the happiness, the GDP, directly links to rainfall. And that is why the monsoon rainfall, in fact, during the Congress administration, I still remember during Rajiv Gandhi's time, they had the first supercomputer to predict monsoon. And the monsoon forecast was such a secret, it wouldn't be let out until like the first rains come, because they know the minute the forecast is put out, immediately markets move, there is hoarding of commodities and everything. So it is so intricately linked with the socioeconomic health of the country in a way that I would say probably no other place or country on the earth has its climate so much intricately linked with the well-being. To the extent that we have history, religion, culture, everything is linked all the way to our history of 3, 4, 5,000 years. You can link with the rhythms of the monsoon. So understanding that is very important. So 2 things, variability. Okay, and I'll come back to the point a little bit on climate change. The bottom is the temperature. Of course, temperature is increasing everywhere, nothing surprising. Okay? And it is also important because collectively, the climate, both temperature and precipitation or rainfall, interacts all aspects or pervades all aspects of the Indian life. And what Anu mentioned about the sustainability, when we think of water resources, agriculture, public health, you just name it. Everything is twined or linked with. And it's only 4 months of rain, that's about it. The top right panels, 2 of them, the blue tells it's from a study from the CEW, the 2022 report. Number of districts experiencing floods, so that's the blue. And then number of districts in each state experiencing drought. Both are going up. Okay. So you have this year-to-year variability, you have country facing wet and then dry, what I call a whiplash. That's what does, the variability does whiplash. Okay? So what are policymakers to do? And the last bottom 2 maps, the top of the bottom 2 map is the trend in average rainfall, and the brownish are lower trend, meaning last 50 years, there is a decrease in rainfall. And the bottom right is same trend of the extreme rainfall. And you see all blue color, that means the extremes are increasing, the average rainfall is decreasing. And then you have year-to-year variability. And now your policymakers, your economists, what kind of policy you need to put in place. Okay. Anything that you do not have to manage the variability, I would say talking about climate change is a luxury for countries like India and Indonesia. And this is someone who does work on climate. I mean, this is not to say there's no climate change. This is to say that if you want to manage and plan and mitigate for climate change, which is more like the temperature slowly increasing, the farmer who's got a 2-acre plot, that farmer says, look, last year was dry, by the way, because of El Nino. Next year will be wet. I lost everything last year. How am I to manage the whiplash? So unless we put in systems to manage that whiplash, talking about climate change will be mostly academic, because it is hard to mobilize people to look at what will happen in 2070 and let's plan for it. It's like, hey, I need to plan for next 2 years, and I don't have the resources. Contrast that with the West here. I do a lot of work on the Colorado River. You have systems in place, institutions in place that take in and integrate society, climate. As a result, when you are planning and thinking about climate change, it's very easy to add on to that existing framework, and it makes it much more productive. Okay, so last slide, and then I'll stop there. Oh, here, sorry. I'm sorry. Okay, so this is, oops. So I just wanted to, yeah, thank you. I just wanted to make one point on that. Yes?
On this one?
One before? No, I can use that, yeah. So this bottom left cartoon kind of tells climate drives, or it integrates agriculture, economy, health. So all 3 are interconnected, and climate is this driver that pervades all of them. Okay. So that's why understanding climate means you can get to all of these and then also their interconnections. So what do we do? What are some potential solutions? So how do we build resiliency in a situation like this, where you have these extremes and you have this whiplash, and people are exposed, infrastructure is exposed. By the way, the latest that is, I'm sure all of you are reading, is the water crisis in Bangalore. And as civil engineering professor, when I try to excite students into civil engineering, that's what I tell. You can't code your way out of that problem. And so as much as you like data, as much as you like all that, at the end of the day, civil engineering is what makes everything else possible. You don't have running water, you don't have indoor plumbing, coding and building the next Google is not on your minds. Okay. So what are the things we can do? And in fact, we can do a lot of things. Early warning is where I feel the most we can help diaspora, and then also Indian government is putting lots of money into this, whereby you develop systems using a lot of open source data to issue warnings, early warnings, both during the event, before the event, and there's lots and lots of science that is advanced that can be brought to bear. And what I lastly call, the last mile problem, which is all of this forecast information exists at scales where decisions are not made. Decisions are made at point scales, regional scales. The forecasts are made on county. If you are in a climate model, it's made on a climate model grid, which is often tens or hundreds of kilometers. So the scale mismatch of information is a huge problem. And this is something we've seen in recent floods, for example, the Chennai floods, where my folks were impacted. The information necessary is not where what is available, even though a lot of information is available. And there's a lot of tools that I put there. There's role for AI, ML, public sector, private sector. And the bottom right is a plug for one such tool, which is the ChennaiRains.com, which is a nonprofit individual who puts out excellent forecasts of weather for Chennai and Tamil Nadu. And he's not even a meteorologist. And he's been doing this last 10 years. And I've been telling nonprofits and others, that's the kind we need to empower. And now we can do way more efficiently with the talent here and also talent in India. So anyway, I'll stop there, and hopefully this will spawn some thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Next up, we have Apmanulal, who's a polymath, who's got work on so many different areas. So I'm hoping that he will sort of integrate a lot of the topics that we've talked about today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Shazeen. Is this working? Yeah. Okay, good. I always like to start something with a story. And first, I would like to thank Prabhu for introducing the famine drought PDS story. For me, it's personal. Things happen in people's childhood that shape the rest of their life, and this is one such thing. 1966, I lived in Chandigarh. I was 10 years old, and what I distinctly remember about that was going every day to the fair price shop at 6 or 7 in the morning to find if we could get wheat or rice or sugar, and coming back every day because they had run out by the time our turn came. This is the famine that he talked about. Drought is the meteorological phenomena. The famine is the loss of food availability. Well, my question to my mother one day was, we get Coca-Cola to deliver to us every other week. Why can't we just drink Coca-Cola all the time? Why do we have to have food? The result of that question was that Coca-Cola was banned. But there's something interesting about this. Anywhere you go in the world, you can now get bottled water or Coca-Cola. It's very sustainable, apparently. I don't know if that meets Anu's definition. Sort of there. One of the 500. So for about 10 years, we tried to work in India to try to understand what we could do about groundwater depletion, what we could do about nutrition, and what we could get the government at that time to do to change. And this work was bottom-up, working with farmers to try to improve irrigation technologies because the interest was water. It was top-down, working with the Gujarat government at the time and the Manmohan Singh government from the center. And for me, I'm a perpetual student, so part of it was I just wanted to learn what's going on. And on the topic of the PDS, I'm just going to jump into that because we solve famines in India. So that's a major credit, no matter what, right? Because we have to acknowledge that. There are two parts to the procurement and distribution system. So part of what Prabhu talked about was the distribution part. There's the procurement part. And I'll add one thing to that which connects to what Balaji talked about. And that is that the plan is to have enough grain in stock to meet 2 years of demand. 2 or 3 years of demand. So if you end up with too much stock, the government has to release it. If you end up below a threshold, you have to procure more aggressively. But the interesting part of the procurement process is it's supposedly national, but it actually is really implemented only in a few places which have high productivity. So that leads to the groundwater depletion, that leads to the free electricity and all of that. But you know what? Instead of complaining about it, my reaction to it is the following. The government of India runs the largest contract farming operation in the world, and they have demonstrated that they can do this successfully, sort of. There's also 30% loss of grain on an annual basis, right? But we do distribute it and we do all of those things. So this is the biggest lever available because if I start from the farmer end, it's really too complex to try to make change. This lever works. So how do you restructure that lever, which was part of what Prabhu was talking about? And what we found was that it's actually feasible to do so. Basically, what you do is procure nationally. What you're doing right now is procure in certain places only. And once you redesign the procurement system to procure nationally, the groundwater depletion goes away, the excess energy use goes away. The income in Telangana, Andhra, Haryana, and Punjab for the farmers goes down. And that's the political problem. But that political problem is not hard to solve because the government of India, interestingly, over global prices for procurement of these things. Their management of the stocks can be improved, right? Their offer to pay more for chana, for dal, and so on in Punjab, Haryana, the crops that were grown there historically. Okay. Our models actually found something interesting. The cropping pattern that is optimal for India from a water perspective is the cropping pattern that existed before the Green Revolution. Go figure. Okay. It takes a few centuries for people to figure that out. We need to restore that cropping pattern. If we can do that, and we pay for it, we actually end up with sustainability, and he showed the numbers associated with the sustainability aspect. So this is one part of the story. The second part of the story is the nutrition angle. And it's interesting because fruits and vegetables were brought up. So I was, being a total vegetarian and fruit and vegetable lover, my reaction was, why is it that this is not the right thing to grow? And there are two aspects to that. One aspect is that markets for fruits and vegetables are local. As a result, what happens is that if you have overproduction in that area, there's a price collapse and the farmer doesn't want to take that risk. So why is this local? It's local because India imposes tariffs every time a state boundary is crossed. So if one anecdote with that is, I realized at some point that cashews in Chandigarh were more expensive than cashews in New York, and they came from South India. I was thinking, what the hell is this about? So it's because every time a state boundary is crossed in India, you pay tariffs on those cashews, whereas you don't if they are flown to New York. Right? So we need to get rid of that because you expand the markets, and that gives some safety associated with what goes on with farmers. Second thing there is that fruits and vegetables have a shorter shelf life. So you need to have a cold storage. And growing up at a time when, even though my father was a doctor, we didn't have a refrigerator in our house until I was 10 or 12 or something like that. So you had to basically go and rely on what was available that day in the market. Once refrigeration comes in, you extend the shelf life of these systems. How do we do a cold storage system that is national? In a place where energy is highly constrained and expensive, you don't do that. A lot of people in the private sector, the Ambanis and others, have tried to do this. They have not been able to do it. However, from an engineering perspective, this is something we could do because you can leverage subsurface below ground storage, and also with cheap electricity, what we look at today is a revolution that, Nikit alluded to. It's a global revolution where if you look at 2050, we are going to have super abundant, low-cost energy locally, everywhere. And this transforms Africa, this transforms India, this transforms Latin America. That's what we have to leverage into this particular equation, and we have it solved. So I'll stop with that. I did not take up more time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I would love for Prabhu to respond or make his own comments. Thank you.
No, this is great. I really appreciate your comments. Here's an interesting fact. In most developing countries, if wheat or rice prices go up, you lose elections. In India, you lose elections if onion prices go up or tomato prices go up. And that's because we've just not invested in diversity, in perishable products, in producing and storing, transporting perishable food, which is extremely nutritious. Because of the focus that we've had on just the basics. So basic staple prices have been, even during the height of COVID, basic staple prices remain fairly stable. But horticulture products, vegetables. One of the things that I've been thinking about quite a bit, and I've been trying to work with different ministries in India on, is to think about nutrition not as one sector issue, but thinking about it as a multi-sectoral issue. And Sangeeta reminded me of that after my talk today. So when you think about nutrition, it's not just food, not just nutritious food. It's also clean drinking water, it's sanitation, it's access to toilets, it's access to public health facilities, it's behavior change, all of these coming together. And unless you have all of these elements coming into one common objective of reducing malnutrition, you're not going to make progress. But the way it happens is the Ministry of Agriculture is in charge of the production of fruits and vegetables. The Ministry of Water is in charge of the drinking water issues, etc. Ministry of Women and Child Development is in charge of women's empowerment issues. The Public Health Ministry is in charge of something else. And none of these ministries talk to each other. And so unless you have a way in which all these ministries talk to each other about a common problem, you're not going to be able to solve it. So a few years ago, the government of India set up what was called Poshan Abhiyan. It was a group of people who would come together multisectorally to address the problem of child malnutrition. And so this seemed like music to our ears, because this is exactly what we were all thinking about, bringing all these groups together. Unfortunately, it was placed in one of the ministries which were not very powerful. Politically, it was placed under the Secretary of the Ministry of Women and Child Development. Now, because of that, the Ministry of Agriculture and others did not give it the support and the power that it needed. Now, suppose you had taken that group and put them under the office of the Prime Minister. It would have been a very different outcome. It would have had a greater authority, it would have had greater buy-in from different groups. And I think as we think about policy change, policy reform, we need to think about what are the levers that are going to bring those reforms. Because most of us can say, here are the big solutions. The solutions are there, but just getting to those solutions and implementing the policies that allow those solutions to happen has been a major, major bottleneck. Can I make one more comment? Second issue that's bothering me a lot is You know, the donor community basically decides on what's the priority of the day, and then they dump a lot of money on that priority, right? A few years ago, when I was working at the Gates Foundation, nutrition was a big priority. So there was a lot of money that went into nutrition. Before that, it was increasing agriculture productivity, etc. Now the priority is climate mitigation, and especially greenhouse gas reduction. And so the amount of donor support that's going into greenhouse gas reduction and climate mitigation is enormous, and it's driving away all other priorities in developing countries. So even in very poor developing countries, the priorities from the donors are climate mitigation. So we've been saying, look, is there a way that you can marry zero emissions with zero hunger? Can we come up with some way in which you can actually continue to address your hunger requirements, your nutrition requirements, while meeting these emission reduction goals of the donors? And there are opportunities, because there are lots of ways in which one can look at agriculture, production, and productivity in a way that's less in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. That's possible. But it again requires a multisectoral approach. It again requires a common understanding of a goal and then working towards that together. And I think that continues to be a big challenge. And some people are starting to take that seriously, but that's an opportunity again as you look forward.
So much. So given time, I'm going to ask that Anu end our conversation, and then we can open it up to some discussion and Q&A.
I'll follow the same idea of challenges and opportunities, and then we'll open it up rather than have more panel discussion. And I was going to say that one place where all those provisioning systems come together is actually urban areas. If you look at them from a transboundary perspective, that is actually the nexus. Most of the world is going to be urban. 400 million plus urbanites are going to come into cities. And so the opportunity is what Nikit said for the energy system, that 60 or 70% of those new cities are yet to be built. And those new provisioning systems don't even exist. And so the opportunity to come in to think about a more integrated solution is really ripe. The second challenge, which I want to come back to this question of inequalities, is that in urban areas, it's not easy to measure inequalities because it's at very fine scale. And so, if you have ward level data, it actually doesn't address the sub-ward level inequality because of how much, and you know this, people try to live, there's a lot of, our neighborhoods are very fragmented and they're very, they're not diverse. And so you end up having a lot of inequality that's very difficult to measure, similar to what Sangeeta was saying. And so if we're thinking about how to go forward addressing a good life for all within planetary boundaries, the challenge is how do you include all? What does that mean? But then also if the leverage of these systems is really powerful, water, sanitation, food, energy, whole systems, everything you said is the 7 provisioning systems. What is that? How do you overcome the fragmentation? That's the challenge. I believe that there are structures coming out. We are working with the Chennai Metropolitan Development Authority, which may be a better scale. Balaji talked about the scale problem. And so that's where I think there's a lot of opportunity in doing some experimental learning. What's the right scale? What's the right scale of data? What's the right scale of solutions? But I think that's a problem everywhere. It's a problem here. It'll be a problem all over Africa where urbanization is similar. But I remain hopeful in the vein of optimism and pessimism because I think what Nikit was saying is those trends are very favorable. in many ways, but equally the political system is probably disfavorable. And so the sort of bottom-up activism that we talked about, I think has a very important role going forward.
I'd like us all to thank the wonderful panelists. And then we have around 10 minutes for Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, please.
So I have a kind of a philosophical question, which is, since everyone talks about we are in the age of Anthropocene, and in the age of Anthropocene, human beings are as much geological agents as the Earth systems. Okay, so when we think of what should be done, one cannot be human-centric to the extent that humans are part of the planet. So I was thinking of the numbers that you said. 20, 500, 900. Did I get it right? Okay. So one has to then, I think, rethink those numbers rather than see those as kind of opportunities. One has to also rethink how human beings inhabit this earth, and not just in kind of human beings in a generic sense, but the thing that Anu referred to, that human beings live in political systems which creates its own pressures. There are corporate interests. We know there are coal interests, and so there was a time when, you saw the earth and you saw coal. You saw a river, you saw a bridge. And that was a kind of a human-centric approach to nature. So in thinking about kind of sustainability, or let's say infrastructure, how can we think of the relationship, let's say, for example, urban systems, okay, in a way that doesn't take for granted that urban system requires this infrastructure, this infrastructure, and let's find a technological solution for it, which is respectful of nature, which takes nature as, as a kind of finite resource, but it still takes it as a resource. So I think philosophically, one needs to kind of rethink the question of, what is the problem?
Is there another question, please? There's a couple over there. Go ahead. Are there other questions?
Thank you so much. I have a question about sustainable cities and how they fit into economic development. So in the morning, we heard a lot of perspectives that were aligned with the idea that maybe urbanization, development, industrialization go together, like in the example of Shenzhen in China. On the other hand, some of the graphs that Anu put up communicated pretty clearly that India's megacities as they exist now, like Delhi, are not sustainable by a lot of conventional definitions. So I don't want this to come across as too pessimistic, but I'm curious for your take. Is the best feasible future to envision one in which the megacities as they exist become more sustainable? Is it one in which we apply those principles towards the urbanization that has not yet happened, as you and the other panelists put up? Or is it one in which we seriously question whether urbanization is a goal if we think more holistically about development?
Thanks. I just wanted to ask a very specific question about nutrition, and this idea or the way the discussion was going, that there should be a powerful ministry, or people, there should be some multi-sector towards the end, and before that also the discussion. I think I tried to argue in the morning that this chain of thinking is too centralized to make any effective impact in terms of solutions in India. So the idea that somehow we can, and I would be very interested in knowing what your thoughts are with respect to this in terms of urbanization also, but at least in the terms of nutrition, the idea that somehow, or early childhood education, that somehow we can decide these things sitting in Delhi is just so far from reality. Even the simple schemes that have worked moderately well in India, whether it's Rural Employment Guarantee Act or midday meal schemes, started out very, very small and were eventually scaled up. So I'd love to know your thoughts about even climate, for example, somehow looking for these global solutions at an all India level. Is that even feasible or the right way to think about it? I'm reasonably certain that in terms of nutrition and early childhood care, that's exactly the wrong way to think.
So I was just struck by a comment that Prabhu made at the end, which is the idea that we want zero greenhouse gas emissions and zero hunger, and we tend to think of them in pretty siloed ways. Right? And is there a way to combine these two objectives in some sense? And my mind went back to the opening panels on political and economic issues. And if you think back, the economists, by and large, I'm looking at Rohit to see if he'll contest, by and large, we're optimizing on a certain set of GDP numbers or inequality numbers, et cetera. And the political scientists were optimizing around a different set of objectives. And then I was reflecting, I do all my work in developing countries, not just India, and I was reflecting on spatial variation, intertemporal variation, in the extent to which, let's just say, political inclusion has led to economic inclusion, or vice versa. And I, in small sample correlation in my head, concluded that I can't see any correlation. There are plenty of instances when there are populations that are politically included, they have the vote, and the vote is effective, but actually does not translate into economic benefit. It's harder to come up with situations where there is an economically included party that does not find a way to be politically included. But it's not perfect either. So both these comments, whether it's a zero hunger, zero greenhouse gas emissions, or the political economic inclusions, are ways of saying that, in a sense, the frailty of the human mind leads us to address all these problems in silos, including us in our different panels. So like Gyan, it's a bit of a philosophical comment, and not necessarily meriting an immediate response, but I'll leave it with that.
Sure. No, that question definitely is philosophical. And honestly speaking, the answer, I would say, it depends on what time scale you're looking at. For a 20, 30, 40 year, 50 year time scale, and that all us academic researchers fall prey to, essentially you are going to look at how do you fit in sustainable development in the existing model of urbanization, existing model of development, and so on. But of course, when you take 100, 200-year perspective, then those philosophical questions obviously take more precedence. But however, I think this is where I truly believe India is uniquely positioned to show an India way of development, really skip the energy-intensive path towards development, and just don't follow the energy intensity curve that Western countries followed. Just fly under the radar with ultra low energy consumption, more efficient energy consumption, clean energy consumption, and still achieve the same level of human development index that the West has achieved. And India truly is at that juncture that it can achieve that. Now, this also leads to your question about how do you plan sustainable cities and what's the definition of what's the right way of urbanization and so on. And again, that definitely warrants a longer discussion, may not necessarily, we cannot wrap it up in a few minutes. But it again goes to this, the root is, can India take a different pathway than the Western countries? And the answer is a strong yes, it can, and I am an eternal optimist, and it will.
So I thought I'll just follow this question that Jan raised, but also I think you were talking about urbanization as well. So maybe I'll But to me, one of the bigger questions is when I talk about a good life for all within planetary boundaries, the bigger question is what is development at all to begin with? And so a lot of times I begin with Amartya Sen, saying development is about human capabilities. But it's not that nature and human capital is an input into the system, which is what the GDP vision of development is. Oh, sorry. So I don't know if you heard me, but I was just saying that the idea of well-being and human agency and human capabilities being both the means and the goal of development is very different from an input-oriented view of saying, here's human labor, here is resources, and here's GDP. And I think that's what the sustainability community, by and large, has accommodated or adopted. And the other thing is there's a lot of conversation between indigenous communities in some of this co-production work. And last week, I'm digressing a little bit, but it's a nice conversation. We had a talk by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I don't know if you've read some of her work. And she said this question of how so many indigenous communities view nature as them. It's not separate. And in that notion, but she also recognized, she's a botany, biology professor, and so she had a beautiful diagram, and she called it a two-sided view, that you have to acknowledge how you deal with nature in its deeper sense, not as a resource to be used, but at the same time, how do you think about science? And of course, there's a bigger conversation of how to do that. But I thought, there was pin drop silence. She spoke for 80 minutes. And about this two-sided view of these different views of nature and how do you bring that to bear. I'll quickly talk about urbanization. I actually was dying to say something in the morning. There's a lot of feeling like, oh, urbanization is not working only in India, or something must be wrong. There's actually nice work from several groups that is showing that urbanization has not reaped the benefits we've had in the US and the EU and so on, because of globalization. And the argument is, like when Chicago grew, all the little towns in the Midwest also grew because they were the breadbasket. But now when a city urbanizes in India, you were talking about global supply chains of food. So that prosperity isn't actually going outward. And so you have this strange urbanization, but it's not unique to India. So this idea that somehow globalization, among other things, has interrupted the benefit that people technically believe. And so my answer is not megacities. In fact, I think the most interesting things are happening in metro regions at the junction of where those small towns are urbanizing. I think the biggest opportunity is there, and that's why I don't think the megacity focus. In fact, most of urbanization in India is going to happen in places that are less than 1 million. Actually, even less than 500,000. And that's where I think thinking about rural-urban interactions, all of that, there's so much room to connect the dots between the things we've been talking about at that interface. I know it's a long answer.
It's okay. So I would like to have Rohit's question be answered by Manu and Prabhu.
Does it work? Yeah. Okay. So that's a question that's challenging, so I can answer that. Obviously, I don't agree with you. So there's a misunderstanding between project-level work relative to public policy and public investment. So if you say project-level work on nutrition and taking communities and improving their nutrition, okay, I agree. There's no role for central government there. But if you think about public policy, specifically the role of agriculture policy in promoting diversity in the food system, that's definitely a central government issue. If we talk about the role of incentives for farmers to move from a staple-centric agriculture to a diversified agriculture, that's definitely a central government policy issue. These have direct impacts on nutrition outcomes. Then if you think about public investments, in clean water systems, public investments in education, public investments in women's empowerment. These are areas where the central government can put enormous resources to help states and local communities do that. And the outcomes from that have been shown time and again to improve nutrition and child health outcomes across the world and also in India. So that's what we are talking about. We're not talking about small project level interventions that the government of India is going to do. That's the bigger picture, I think, that needs to be understood. And my frustration is agriculture policy is still designed for famine reduction. Agriculture policy is not designed for improving nutrition. That's my point.
That was a great answer. I'll just add one little thing to it to hit an economist with. There's two aspects to the roles here. One is providing services, centralized versus decentralized. The second is risk management. So if you think about this as a risk famine that has to be managed, you want to transfer the risk to the highest level that can actually buffer it. So that's part of the answer, and that's why this is a famine program. I wanted to actually respond to Gyan, who has now vanished, so maybe it wasn't all for a response. But the issue of the Anthropocene is similar to the issue of climate change. I think these things are highly misunderstood. For one, I will point to the fact that Malthus pointed out the limits to growth and the fact that humanity cannot make it to the point we are at today, 250 years ago. That doesn't mean that Malthus was wrong. Concerns were restated by the Club of Rome in the 1960s, and we have gone way beyond that. One thing to think about is that maybe we live inside, I'm blanking out, this device, the pinball machine. And so effectively, it's not about seeking sustainability and achieving it because we cannot. That's an equilibrium concept, and we are not in an equilibrium game. If you think about the fact that there was no such thing as the internet just 30 years ago or 35 years ago, there was no such thing as an iPhone, and what they have transformed in terms of human interactions and human life, we are constantly moving to new platforms, and we are essentially a non-stationary society and a non-stationary process. So to look at the past is useful, because it tells you some idea of the limits, but essentially what we seem to learn from them, and this is not my opinion necessarily, but what we seem to learn from them is what we want to do next. That is more damaging, more different perhaps, but we are constantly evolving, where if I think further, we probably will evolve out of this planet at some point in my lifetime. And people are progressing in that direction. So talking about what limits we put on ourselves is moot, because we are not going to respect them.
Thank you. Last comment, Balaji?
So just to add to what Manu said on the risk and the climate point, climate mitigation or climate change mitigation is at an elemental level risk management, because 100 years out, 50 years out, you cannot translate that to a farmer to adopt X, Y, or Z. It has to be at the highest level where the risk can be managed. So for example, what I wanted to point out with the whiplash effect is that if you have systems to manage that risk at that shorter time scale, it is much easier to think and mitigate and adapt to the longer term risk like the climate change, which is on a much longer time scale. So for example, with agriculture, you strengthen insurance, you strengthen safety nets, then you can have a conversation with the farmer on how do you want to manage, look, 30 years from now it's going to get more dry or you're going to get more extremes. Then the person can think about the infrastructure, management infrastructure they have, and then creatively use that to mitigate that future long-term risk. Otherwise, the conversation seems to kind of just get stuck with that, what do I do next year? And then it goes nowhere, and like what Prabhu said, there is this tons of resources going into studies with climate change, where we know what's going to happen in terms of climate, but the solutions are hard to implement because the public or the farmers are not, or the constituents say, look, I need to get through 2 years before I can think 50 years. So that is where the variability kills. And if you can manage variability, you can manage long-term change.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the wonderful panel. I think I'm going to pass it on to you to announce the next.